Our next speaker is Graham Young. Graham is currently a PhD candidate in social inquiry at La Trobe University. His research focuses on the way advertising reflects broader social and cultural trends. In his work, Graham examines advertising as an art form. His interdisciplinary project covers topics such as economics, climate change, and politics, with a focus on how advertisements from organisations such as banks, NGOs, and political parties reflect a structure of feeling called metamodernism. Graham regularly works as an academic tutor at La Trobe University and the University of Melbourne. His review, entitled Hope and Melancholy, an examination of Lars von Trier's Melancholia, was recently published in Screen Thought Journal. He is also on the editorial board of the re-established Altitude e-journal, and today Graham will present The Third Wave, Metamodernism and Environmental Advertising. Right.
Let's make sure that I'm sharing the screen with everybody. Can everyone online see that? Okay.
Yep.
Great. Alrighty. Well, it might have been a bit ambitious to speak as well as host this Metamodernism conference, but I will do my best. Basically, I'd like to talk to you guys about the third wave of environmental or green advertising and how this third wave, compared to the previous two, reflects metamodern sensibility. So even though we've had plenty of presentations so far, we haven't really touched much on the modern and the postmodern side of things, and I want to kind of expand on that a little bit for people online. They might be coming at it new or what have you. But basically, if we're going to understand metamodernism, it situates itself epistemologically with postmodernism, ontologically between postmodernism, and historically beyond postmodernism. And that's a quote from Vermeulen and Van Acker. But all of those epistemology, ontology, those are all very complex kind of words. And what does it actually mean for those things to be with, between, and beyond? So to dig into modernism a little bit more and understand what it is generally perceived as positivistic, technocentric, and rationalistic. Universal modernism has been identified with the belief in linear progress, absolute truths, the rational planning of ideas, social orders, and the standardization of knowledge and production. So, and what I will do is I'll show you an ad that basically highlights these kind of ideas to really kind of cut through some of the jargon. So with that in mind, we kind of have a bit of an idea about what modernism is, and now we can move to postmodernism. So postmodernism is, above all, a response to our increased awareness of the great diversity in human cultures, a diversity that calls into question the possibility of a universal or privileged perspective, and that thus values the juxtaposition of different perspectives and different voices, and a contemplation of connection rather than a subordinated structure of ideas that achieves a unified voice and a conclusive perspective. If we're going to understand modernism, that unified voice would be that white, male, privileged point of view, right? Whereas postmodernism, looking at people more individuals and their subjective experience, right? And the value of their cultures, and not privileging European or American culture. So knowing a bit more about what modernism is, what postmodernism is, we can return to what metamodernism is. Metamodernism oscillates between the modern and the postmodern. It oscillates between a modern enthusiasm and a postmodern irony, between hope and melancholy, between naivety and knowingness, empathy and apathy, unity and plurality, totality and fragmentation, purity and ambiguity. However, and this is what I pointed out with Sean, one should be careful not to think of this oscillation as a balance. Rather, it is a pendulum swinging between 2, 3, 5, and 10, innumerable poles. Each time the metamodern enthusiasm swings towards fanaticism, or let's say being overly emotional, gravity pulls it back towards irony or reason. The moment its irony swings towards apathy, gravity pulls it back towards enthusiasm. So it's this kind of constant cycle, which is why it might be better to understand it as Metamodernism 2.0 or the second, third, fourth, whatever phase of Metamodernism. So we come now, and this informs my PhD, is the threefold threat that the Mullen and Van der Acker thought basically made Metamodernism emerge. So they claimed that it emerged out of the financial crisis, the GFC, and the outcome of that, socially speaking, was this collective loss of trust in the economic system, which, if you look at the advertising of banks, you will see one of the big kind of sentiments that they use after the GFC is trying to win back trust, trying to get people back on side and say, listen, we're not so different. We're trying to help you. You're trying to help us. We're all in this together kind of thing. So there's that element of unity and totality to those kind of messages. We'll be focusing today on climatological uncertainties, so environmental and energy crisis. And what I've noticed in my research on that is a very clear changing message, which is what I'll show you guys. And then the last is political instabilities, failure of the third wave, which was basically a left-leaning capitalist system, whereas traditionally what the third wave was, it emerged out of the far left, so far more socialist, but basically they sort of moved more towards the right wing. So they understood the value of the economics of things. And basically that failure of third way politics led to an increase in polarization, which you can see through things like the rise of populism. So we'll move on to, I'll briefly mention why advertising compared to things like film or novels or anything like that. And basically, according to McLuhan, historians and archaeologists will one day discover that the ads of our time are the richest and most faithful daily reflections any society ever made of its whole range of activities. And really, you can see in ads social and cultural ideas being communicated, right? So one of the things that some people may notice in ads is that there has been an emergence of multicultural relationships, and that kind of basically communicates that those multicultural relationships are fine. They're part of the norm. It's no big deal. Whereas prior to, let's say, 2000, a lot of the time it was just heterosexual white relationships, right? So we're seeing far more diversity emerge in ads, which basically reflects the diversity of contemporary society and culture. So we'll move on to understanding what the first two waves of green or environmental advertising was all about. Basically, the first wave was all about conservation and protection. So if you guys can remember back to, I believe it was 1966 to about 1991, we'll see in the next slide. But those ads were very much about protecting animal and plant life and, you know, clean air, getting rid of pollution, that sort of stuff. In the second wave, the major concern was global warming, right? And so they started using all of these disaster narratives, which you can kind of see on screen. So smog, wild storms, bushfires, stuff like that, right? It's the, it's the imagery of climate hell, essentially. And so I'll talk a little bit about why each of these two waves, how they began, what they looked like, and why they failed eventually. So the first wave started about 1966 and lasted until about 1991. The environmental movement first kind of really started with Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring, which was published in 62, I believe. And basically she called attention to the way pesticides were filtering through the environment and then in turn poisoning the people who were eating, say, the crops, or then poisoning, they would poison the insects, which would poison the fish, which would poison the birds, right? So she really drew attention to this very tentative, very fragile relationship with the environment. So you change one little thing and the rest kind of deteriorates. So primarily concerned with pollution and conservation, this kind of first wave pushed for large-scale regulations and legislation through grassroots socio-political activism. So this is kind of a period where Greenpeace, Sierra Club, WWF kind of emerged. Basically, going back to Michael's point about the resolution of TVs, right? So advertisers realized that their products, if they were environmental in some kind of capacity, provided a unique selling point, right? So you could sell more of your product if you said it was environmentally friendly. So unfortunately, the movement suffered setbacks under Reagan and similar kind of Western administrations' policies of deregulation, which was all aimed to increase economic production. However, saw a slight resurgence following the introduction of the idea of sustainable development. Before getting to why it failed, we need to understand what the idea of greenwashing is. So it is a practice that makes an intentionally unsubstantiated, misleading claim about the environmental benefits of the product, service, which makes it sound more environmentally friendly than it is. And there are plenty of examples of that. But the possible decline of this first wave of environmental advertising is the consumer backlash. So they discovered that the products weren't really that environmentally friendly, and they would write to people and say, it's not good enough. Increased government legislation, increasing advertising regulations. So there was more standards. You couldn't say it's environmentally friendly if it wasn't, right? The next wave was fundamentally influenced by the inconvenient truth. So the inconvenient truth really started that kind of narrative of climate hell. And that kind of message and those kind of imageries were taken up by those advertisers and put into their messages. And so the primary concern with that second wave of advertising was ozone layer, greenhouse effect, global warming. But then when you get towards the end of that, the noughties kind of decade, the terminology which you can see in relative kind of keyword searches that people were using to look up these topics was that at the first half of that decade, it was global warming. And then right towards the end, there was a change to climate change. So we will continue. And this basically is just a graph showing that people started using the term climate change versus global warming. And there's some reasons behind this. So global warming linguistically is very particular type of phrasing, like it refers to something unpleasant. Whereas so warming, people don't like being warm. Whereas climate change is just something that seems more kind of natural and benign, where global warming is something unpleasant and you don't want that to happen. So this kind of change may be an indication, which I'll help track as we go. So possible reasons for the second wave's decline was possible, so failure of carbon market scheme. So you can think back to Kevin Rudd's carbon tax that completely fell on its face, global financial crisis. So potentially when there was less money going around, there was less incentive, like people were more concerned about their own survival versus the survival. The failure of the Copenhagen Climate Summit. So people had big ambitions for that summit and they just didn't live up to it. But my argument is more that the type of narratives that were being communicated were just too depressing and paralyzing for people to really take up action. And I'll show you an example of them. So these are second wave and what I would consider postmodern advertisements. So, you know, they really lack hope. They're very pessimistic. You'll see one of them super ironic, right? So those are all very postmodern kind of characteristics. So we will start with Beautiful Day, 2007.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Please won't you be my neighbor?
Fairly obvious how ironic and kind of postmodern feeling that one is. This next one is pretty grim, so be warned. So pretty depressing and very upsetting ad. And if you're shown enough of these, the anger that it provokes dissipates, you become numb to it and you become apathetic to that kind of problem, right? So it may be effective in the one instant, make you angry and want to change something. But if you're constantly being shown stories like this, it really, you know, makes you paralyzed and upset and angry, and you know, you just don't want to do anything about it. The next one I will show you is Space Monkey. This is an example of a Metamon ad, in my opinion, and I'll explain that when we get there.
At last, early in 1961, the blue-gray space capsule is ready to take its place atop the launching rocket. The flight plan calls for the Redstone to propel the chimpanzee into the heavens.
Sweet mother, I'm coming home.
so it still ends fairly bleakly, but because we lost so much time trying to set up again, I'll just kind of reel off a few things that I've noticed which make it meta-modern compared to postmodern, which is that there's that modern idea of hope and enthusiasm through the technocentric kind of idea at the very start. So that start was basically a documentary, so it's a real life film that you can watch about the space program. And it's all about, or this is implying the, exalting mankind, the linear progress, things that, just keeping on getting better, right? There's also this idea of ideal social orders, where it's the men who are, working on the space program. It's not, you see no women, right? So it shows that ideal social order of, the modern time. There's also this sense of naivety and knowingness, which is that, the naivety comes because the chimp wants to get home to its handler, right? But it's been 65 years, the guy's probably dead, right? So, but we have that internal feeling. It's like, oh, it would be so nice for those two to reunite. And there's also this idea of knowingness that comes in. So when he lands, that was not an accident that happened to planet Earth, right? It was man-made destruction. They wiped themselves out, right? So we have this sense of naivety and knowingness and the interplay between them. There's also this idea of empathy and apathy. So we empathize with the chimp. He wants to get home to its handler. If you've been separated from a loved one, you kind of have that, you know what that feeling is like. And you have that apathy at the end because, or a touch of it, shall we say, when you see the destruction of Earth. There's also the idea of unity versus plurality, in the sense that it's not a planet, it's a home. So people would sort of come to some consensus about what home is, and it's very unifying idea that all of us probably share a sense of, or a feeling of home, but it's home to 7 billion people, so there is this kind of plurality to that unifying feeling. There's also totality and fragmentation. So the Divine Mother is this kind of epistemological framing device, right? So we can think of that Divine Mother as Gaia or Mother Nature or whatever it is, but she was some divine, omnipotent kind of deity, right? And, if you watch that ad carefully, this light that shines on the chimp here, so you can see in the earlier picture, it's in shadow. So when he speaks to that Divine Mother, she does give him strength and bravery and kind of gives him that. There's also the idea of the subjective postmodern view. So you see through the eyes of the chimp versus the kind of Divine Mother, which is looking out over kind of everything. Also the idea of purity and ambiguity. So mankind being ambiguous, their ambitions may be exceeding their reach, or they cause their own destruction, whereas the Divine Mother is purely good. You can also see the oscillation. So the very first that newsreel is optimistic, and then we see the offside, which is those, that poor chimp, they shot him off into space, and now he's been lost for 65 years. So it goes from optimism and us having that modern mindset to postmodern being pessimistic and thinking, oh, that poor hard done by chimp. He sees Earth, it goes back towards hope and thinking he's finally going back, and then melancholy because the place has been destroyed. So there is that kind of oscillation within that very kind of short space of time, which is why I would consider it more metamodern than any of the two kind of combined. But I'll end there.